Yes, and I would like to first thank you, of course, for inviting me, for giving me this opportunity to present part of my research in this particular setting. And as you already mentioned, I'm actually a sinologist. So I work on Chinese history, but I selected a topic that hopefully many fellow historians can also relate to. So my research focuses on the intersecting academic and political networks of 20th century China. And I'm examining how academic elites and communist cadres were tied together through personal and professional networks or personal and professional ties. But this is not the topic of today. I would rather like to talk about the problems of sources that historians specializing in 20th century China face, but that also those historians working in other world regions or periods can probably relate to. So in my specific case, and this is something that most historians of 20th century China share, we struggle with a limited access to archival sources, which is a problem that's even increasing at the moment. And therefore we are heavily reliant on sources published after 1949, so after the communist takeover, after the establishment of the People's Republic. And these sources are, of course, then written by the victors of history and rewritten constantly. And this is, of course, something source bias is known to all of you if you work with historical sources. And obviously, we still have to work with them if they're what we have left. And in the case of network research, this means, of course, that we also have to abstract structures from these textual sources that are both very often biased and or incomplete. For the sources from the People's Republic of China, however, these biases and gaps are not random. In fact, what we see is that Chinese publications, especially on the 19th and 20th century history, are carefully constructed, reconstructed, and they, of course, follow certain narratives of revolution, of heroic resistance, of communist reconstruction, China's rise, etc. And John Israel has described this as I think very much to the point that official historiography is an autobiographical exercise in which the leading character is none other than the Chinese Communist Party itself. So here we already see a little bit the connection also between historical narratives and the biographical exercise here. And as I would argue in my talk, is that as many of these narratives are rather implicit than explicit, and that network methodology can actually help us to abstract these guiding principles behind the narrative construction, and doing so by turning secondary sources into primary sources. What that actually means, I will talk about that in a minute, but I would like to say first a few things about collective biographies as sources. And this is also what gets us then further into the topic of the reconstruction of networks. So collective biographies in general, they consist of a kind of two-step selection process. So first, when you compile a collective biography, you of course first select people you think are noteworthy or exemplary in whatever respect. And then you tell their life stories as you see fit. So if you think of them as exemplary for a certain profession, for example, you would probably tell their life story accordingly. This means you would tie these people to certain historical events that they participated in or to other actors that you think are relevant. And you would also omit other events or encounters. And these patterns that emerge from these biographies, tying one biographical sketch to another, this is something that then reveals underlying historical narratives on the individual as well as collective level. How that actually works is, if you think about it, is pretty obvious. So you have a biographical sketch of an individual A, and in this sketch, other people are mentioned, say person A, B, C. And in network terms, we would think of that as a one-mode network, right? It's people tied to other people. You can also create an ontology of relationship types, father of, wife of, studied with, etc. And I call these nodes that are mentioned in the biographies of someone biographical nodes. We also, of course, have the two-mode structures, because in biographies, not only other people are mentioned, but also other events, institutions that people took part in. This would be then kind of a two-mode structure. So to test that hypothesis and to see if we can really reconstruct historical narratives from these collective biographies, I selected two collective biographies. Both are in Chinese, both came out in the late 1980s. The first one is Considering the Value of Women's Lives from the December 9th movement. The December 9th movement was actually a movement in 1935 directed against Japanese aggression. And you have a second volume called Record of Famous Chinese Women, which actually collects about 1,400 biographical sketches of modern-day Chinese women. And as you see, both of these biographies are edited under the auspices of the All China Women's Federation, which is a corporate body under the tutelage or under the supervision of the Chinese Communist Party. And just giving you a very brief historical background, we have in the early 20th century new spaces for activism and kind of civil engagement opening up in China. And of course, women also began to take their position in society, to use these spaces for all kinds of political activism. Some of that is, of course, activism geared towards women's rights. You also have activism that is more patriotic in nature, like we see with the December 9th movement against foreign aggression, and so on and so forth. And especially in the communist movement, what we see is that we, on the one hand, have kind of a lip service to women's rights and women's liberation. And we do see that in the 1920s and 1930s in China, communist groups were much more open to the idea of women's rights and much more liberal in that respect than other groups. But still, even within these groups, women were never fully equal. And on the other hand, the communist movement soon realized that women were actually a very important resource for organizing and for making use of their networks. So as women in the women's rights movement were quite well organized, the communists realized that these kind of forms of networks that women had formed in their movement could also be used for communist agitation or simply for providing access to certain resources like printing presses, houses for meetings, etc. And however, many Chinese women never formally joined the Communist Party. Many of them were only politically influential through their husbands. So their husbands were famous cadres, and so they also became part of the revolution. And so what I wanted to point out here is this quote I'm showing you here on this slide from actually from the introduction to one of these volumes on the December 9th movement. And the editors here state that the aim of editing this volume was to offer study material for China's revolutionary history, especially the study of the course of the women's movement. At the same time, these historical facts also help us to answer the question of the value of women's lives, which people still discuss today. So what we see here is that these collective biographies obviously have a very educational purpose, kind of narrating or re-narrating history in a certain way and positioning individuals within that history. And within this historical narrative by describing why their lives had value, meaning why they should be remembered. And so my questions are, what was the guiding principle behind the selection of specific biographies? How were life stories narrated and interwoven with historical events and other actors? And what can the arrangement of these aggregated life stories tell us about the official narrative concerning the contribution of women to China's revolution? In other words, I did not seek to reconstruct the actual life or social network of these women from these biographies, or I did not search for commonalities as classical prosopographical studies would do. This is also what I meant when I said that I'm kind of turning these kind of secondary sources into primary sources, granting insight into historical relational narratives. Of course, neither the idea of biographies as narratives nor the idea of narrative networks is very new. We know that collective biographies also resemble autobiographies in a way that they are, as Smith and Watson, for example, said, as they are a set of shifting self-referential practices that, in engaging with the past, reflect on identity in the present. And you probably also all know the study by Bierman and Stovall on becoming a Nazi and the narrative networks there. As a next step, after kind of identifying these two volumes I wanted to study, I also selected a sample of 37 biographies. If there's time later, I'm happy to discuss how I selected them. But my criteria was that they are actually really activists at the time, so mainly in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, and not only activists reconstructed from kind of today's perspective, but that they were actually kind of recognized by their peers as activists at the time. So I sampled 37 biographies, so I selected 37 women and looked at their biographies in these two volumes. The full sample of what I did, which I showed earlier, of these kind of one-mode and two-mode networks that are abstracted from these texts by kind of manual coding. I can also talk about the kind of challenges why I didn't do, why I did this manually. But anyway, this resulted in a full network of over 1,000 ties with 795 nodes. And as I said earlier, these nodes could be people or events and institutions. So these resulted in kind of a network including 52 women and 62 men. And this is kind of the one-mode network I ended up with. And as you can see here, the women are in yellow, the men are in green. If you think about that, these are actually women's biographies. It's quite astonishing how present men are in this network. And of course, you can also easily glean that, of course, for example, you see here, I hope you also see my cursor, you see here Mao Zedong. Of course, everyone wanted to, or kind of to have Mao Zedong as a reference point in your own biography was retelling in regard to what your life value in terms of being part of the communist revolution was. But what you can, this is of course a directed network, so in the sense that whoever is mentioned in someone's biography, that's kind of a link going in that direction from actual biographical sketch to someone being mentioned in this sketch. And what you can, what I was then asking myself is, of course, how do we see what these kind of, whether this kind of network, what kind of features can we observe in this graph? So what I did is I used something that Park and Barabasi had proposed in the article on distribution of node characteristics in complex networks. And that is the question whether these characteristics, in this case being male or female, are actually equally spread throughout the network, or if it's kind of deviating from a random network in which these characteristics were kind of randomly spread throughout the network. And what we see here is that female nodes are actually more densely connected, which is called dyadic, and that women have more ties to men, called heterophilic. When we think about how this kind of deviates also from our inspection of the network, because usually all scholars of kind of women and women activists of that time period in China state that women's networks were mostly among women, right? That at the time in a patriarchal society, women were still much confined to certain spaces in society and mostly kind of interacting with other women. When we look at this graph, however, we see that at least in the depiction of their life stories in these collective biographies, they're always, or in many cases, tied to other men. But we also see that there are apparently some women who get mentioned more frequently in other women's biographies. So they apparently also have some kind of symbolic value that other people felt like it was speaking to their revolutionary vigor, that you have acquainted these people and that they should therefore be mentioned in your biography. Which already brings me to my first conclusion, that women are tied to male figures in their biographies in disproportionately high numbers. Especially connection to important male figures was seen as underscoring the importance of women. As I mentioned earlier, if you, for example, were closely acquainted with Mao Zedong, this would, of course, at least to the reader, speak of your kind of large contribution to the revolution, or at least attest to the fact that you were part of the same circles. And this observation that a high in degree and a low out degree indicates that a woman was perceived to be central to the revolution. So for example, Sung Qingling that you see here, she was mentioned in many other biographies, and simply because she was the wife of Sun Yat-sen, who's kind of revered to as the founding father of modern China. And so association with her was kind of also attesting to your own significance in a way, or the women activist significance. I mentioned earlier that I did kind of two types of analyses. That on the one hand, I looked at the one-mode network that I just showed you, but of course, there's also the two-mode network that I would like to talk about now. So which events, institutions, etc., are mentioned as in a biography in the sense of individual A participated in, for example, this protest, or was a member of this and this study circle, or published in that volume. And publications are actually also included as events here. And this is the resulting two-mode network. Again, institutions in red, events in blue, men are in green, women in yellow. Node sizes according to degree. What we see here, and this is an undirected network because obviously there are no directions here, because obviously you can't have an event directing to a person. You're always just having an event being mentioned in someone's biography. And as you can see, quite interestingly, first of all, that it even connects so well, but you have kind of one deviation here, which is the small component of Wu Shouhong, who is described as a literary figure. So this is something else that is quite interesting, that the compilers of these biographies at least from the famous woman collective biography, they said that there are certain types or certain categories of women that they wanted to include. And so apparently this woman was not depicted as being part of this part of the group of women activists, but it was kind of something different. And because she was described as a literary figure. However, when you look at her life in more detail, after having identified her as being obviously not depicted as part of this network, you see that she could have been connected if certain events or certain people she knew were actually mentioned in her biography. So you could have written her life story very differently, and thereby she would have been part and maybe even a very central figure to this network. And we also see that we have differences in node degree in the 1 and 2 mode network, right? So the 1 mode network who's mentioned in whose biography, and the 2 mode network that also includes kind of, you could be tied to someone because both were said to participate in the same event. And so here you also see that some people apparently are famous because they were, for example, married to an important man, or because they actually participated in many events, or were, for example, and this is also not surprising that the Communist Party is one of the most central nodes in the network, that they were members of the Communist Party and therefore kind of moved to the center of the network as well. So a high in degree in the 1 mode network and a low degree in the 2 mode network is therefore also indicative of personal fame. I mentioned the example of Sung Ching Ling earlier, who is mentioned in many other biographies. But the interesting thing is that in her biography also not many other institutions or events that she took part in were mentioned. And so my conclusion would be, it's just not necessary, because her life value, as the authors of the biographies will call it, it was already known, right? You didn't have to list a lot of famous people or revolutionary organizations that she took part in, simply because she was already established as a figure that was kind of in the limelight of the revolutionary proceedings. So this is another finding, that there are certain types of degree relations, as you might call them, so kind of comparing the variety of degrees in these 1 or 2 mode networks that might be indicative of certain positions. And then my question was, of course, so what holds kind of these stories together? What are the nodes that tie different biographies together? And this, as you can see, I'm sorry, I went too quick there. As you can see, you have a lot of nodes that are actually just, as I mentioned, for example, publications. One person published something. So this would be a kind of a node, but that's not kind of what keeps the network together, right? So if you filter them out, if you filter out all nodes with a degree of 1, you see that kind of the network kind of shrinks considerably. And now again, the question is really interesting when you look at degrees, who has the highest degree now? And suddenly you see some people moving in to the center of attention, like Shen Zijiu, who was actually a lawyer and active in very many events that are kind of mentioned in many biographies as being very central. And so suddenly, if you kind of filter out these not so relevant biographical notes, you also can test if some people actually participated in a high number of seemingly relevant events. I assume they're relevant because so many biographical sketches mention them. And then you can also ask yourself, well, is that person, for example, Shen Zhizhou is quite famous, but she's she would maybe not come to mind as the leading figure. So you can also compare that to your previous perceptions of who's central to the movement. And also interesting, who has lost many ties. Han Yo-tong, for example, she lost a lot of ties because she had a high number of publications. These kind of were filtered out. And so in these kind of pre and post filtering comparisons, they can also tell you quite some interesting things. And then closeness centrality is, of course, of relevance here as well. So the question, who's directly connected to other central nodes? So who's not maybe connected to someone who was then member of the Communist Party, but who's member themselves, or who actually participated in events directly. And interestingly, when you do that, then suddenly, of course, you also have figures where you expected it, but then suddenly also figures like Du Junhui appear, who is actually lesser known figure with a very short biographical sketch, but she appears to be very central. But if we look at the one mode graph, and I might just skip back to that, you see here that she's not even part of this larger network, right? So she's actually in this separate component here. But when you look at the two-mode network and when you look at closeness centrality, you suddenly see that she's actually quite central in the network. So my second conclusion, distinction of how categories of women were constructed within these biographical volumes only became visible through network analysis. So the example of Wu that I showed earlier, I wouldn't have caught that, even my close reading, that it's so dissimilar from the others. It's also quite useful that you can filter out individuals included in the collective biographies because of their association with famous individuals, families, clans, whatever. So I think this could be applicable to a variety of other contexts when you work with collective biographies from other periods or contexts. And what we can also see is that centrality scores can help us to compare persons' position in a network, so their embeddedness in the official narrative and their general fame. This is what I said when kind of reflecting on your preconceived notions of who you expect to be important and those people who actually appear in the network structures as important. What I also, this is kind of obviously informed by also my understanding of how the Communist Party constructs historical narratives. What I realized is that, of course, the association has a temporal dimension, meaning that if you are a member of the Communist Party at the time when they were still persecuted, that is, of course, much speaking to your revolutionary fervor than if you only joined after the communists had won, after 1949. And this is not only my reading, this is actually what you see in the text, because all of these biographical sketches are actually divided into two parts. So you have the first part, and then suddenly you have kind of a delimiter called Jiefang Ho, so after the liberation. And then after the liberation, this woman did this and that and did this and that. So my question was, how much of this network I was seeing, of this two-mode network, is actually held together by nodes that only came into being after 1949? So for example, because people participated in consultative conferences convened by the Communist Party, and therefore their biographies are in this network obviously tied together because they all participated. But this was after 1949. So if I actually want to learn something about their activism or how they're described as women activists before 1949, I do have to kind of filter that out in the network, right? And so this is what I did here, to ask so how much of the network is held together by nodes that emerged after 1949 and how much was already there? And why do some women occupy central positions before 1949, but are not tied to the central nodes emerging after 1949. So the question is, why is women in their biographies, why apparently they didn't have any contact with central figures of the communist revolution, because otherwise that would have been mentioned attesting to their value, right? But why are they only tied to these networks later? And so I filtered out all the notes described in the biography as appearing after 1949. And so I've only looked at the first part of the biography until this kind of delimiter after the liberation, Jiefang-ho, was put in place. And now we see that Zhao Qingge and Bai Yang are now separated from the main component, and people like Jiang Ping, they vanished from the political stage after 1949, which is also quite surprising. So then you can go kind of into microanalysis again and kind of try to retrace their life stories from other sources to see why that happened. And one thing that was also quite interesting is that when you look again at the case of Du Junhui, located here, I already mentioned her earlier. And what's interesting is that she's depicted as central to the pre-1949 network, but actually she lost her party membership because her husband was supposed to be a counter-revolutionary at the time. And so by association, she also lost her party membership of the Communist Party. But this loss of party membership between 1936 and 1947 was actually not mentioned in her biographical sketch in these 2 volumes I looked at. This is something I only gleaned from other sources. So in that sense, it's also quite telling that kind of from hindsight, she was constructed as being always part of the center, always conferring with these other important people, always participating in these major events, not mentioning that actually all ties were cut for a decade. Bringing me to my third conclusion, namely that when we examine the temporal dimension of life narratives, we can untangle retrospective additions to the network or highlight the marginalization of individuals. So individuals can appear central in the network, even though they were isolated for certain periods. And this is something I think you always have to keep in mind, that when people conferred with certain other people that are central in the network, then stopped for a time and then started again, you won't detect that in the network structure. So this brings me to my final conclusion, which is that I hope I was able to show how historical actors with certain attributes, in my case it was just male and female, were presented as being connected or separate. And so connectivity, to look for connectivity between nodes with different attributes can actually help us to understand whether these are just incidental patterns we see, or whether there's kind of a storytelling mode behind that. That we can uncover which attributes are presented as constitutive for prestige. So that's connectivity in relation to node attributes. As I mentioned earlier, for example, who has a lot of incoming nodes, who's mentioned in a lot of other biographies. Also depending, so for example, that men are kind of mentioned much more often because men were in more central positions and held more power, and therefore references to men were more common. We can also uncover how historical actors are categorized. So at least in the examples I looked at, we have this very clear categorization that life stories are depicted depending on who you're supposed to be, whether you fit in the category of writer, of activist, or scientist, etc. So it actually gives you a very powerful tool to disentangle these kind of later day categorizations of individuals. And you can reveal which actors, events, or organizations take central roles in certain historical narratives by looking at centrality measures. And it can also help us to question certain disparities between network position you observe in these kind of narrated life stories and the posthumous fame by comparing these 1 and 2 mode network statistics. And you even have cases of individuals who would have taken central positions if you would have told their life story differently, but who are not selected to be included in the collective biography. So this is a comparison between these kind of narrated networks and the more objective reconstructed networks that you would get if you would have included a variety of sources or written a more objective or more inclusive biography. We also face some problems. I already mentioned the temporal severance of ties, which is easily overlooked. We also have the problem of variety in text length between biographical sketches. Even though I showed earlier that I guess that if you met someone central, if you participated in a central event or organization, that's probably going to be mentioned. And therefore, even though your biographical sketch might be very short, you would still appear in quite a central position in the network, right? And you would also have to incorporate life dates in a larger sample. So what I showed earlier when I said, why are certain people suddenly vanishing after 1949? Why were they so active in these political movements before 1949? And why did the Communist Party apparently did not invite them to the table after establishing the new regime? That's, of course, a question that could also have to do with the people simply died or fell ill. So you would have to take these dates into consideration because in my small data set, I could simply check. But if you have a very large data set, you would have to find a way of kind of including this kind of correlating life dates and kind of exclusion from the network in certain periods of time. Yes, this is, I actually kept this so that we can stop now, and there might be some additional questions, but I'm happy to take questions now and get comments from you all. Thank you.